The fact that that is what you're going to end with tells me that you care more about our Commonwealth and our rights and our freedoms than even your own position. And I thank you for that. There's a reason why we should all vote for Josh Prince.
Definitely.
Well,
I'm moving to PA.
Meet the Pressers with Matt Mallory and Klint Macro. Brought to you by Public Safety and Education and the Trigger Pressers Union.
This episode is brought to you by Sabre Red, pepper spray and safety products for all Americans. Next Level Training, makers of CERT training products. Mantis. Mantis X helps shooters suck less. Firearms Owners Against Crime Institute for Legal, Legislative, and Educational Action. Meet the Pressers is also supported by other shows, companies, and our Patreon members. Thank you.
Hey everybody, Matt Mallory here with Meet the Pressers, and my awesome co-host is back again, Klint Macro. We have a phenomenal guest that we've had on numerous times in the past, and just a wealth of knowledge down in Pennsylvania. I wish he'd moved to New York. But anyways, Klint, why don't you introduce our good friend?
Well, our special and distinguished guest is Mr. Joshua Prince. Josh is a prominent attorney, one of the most preeminent Second Amendment attorneys and civil rights attorneys in Pennsylvania and Maryland. I believe you practice in Maryland too, I think.
I do.
And he happens to be running for Commonwealth Court of Pennsylvania. So that's one of the biggest things we're going to be talking about here today. So Josh, how are you and what's going on with your campaign? What can we do to help you get on that ballot?
Wow, Klint, it's been insane the past couple days. So Friday, had to drive out to Center County for a dinner that went till about 9:15, 9:30. Then had to leave there to drive to Erie that night. Had a breakfast in Erie that morning around 8 a.m. starting, and it lasted until about noon. Then had to drive to Clinton County for a Lincoln Day signing seminar or event. And then left there to drive to Lycoming County, was there until about 9 o'clock, and then had to drive back to Berks County. And then Sunday morning, we actually had an event in Montgomery County. So like I said, it's been a little bit insane recently, and things are going really well. It's really interesting to meet with voters and hear my opponent's position and the information that's not necessarily always relayed on to the voters about experience, and the fact that I'm actually the only Commonwealth Court candidate on the Republican side that has any courtroom experience. And by courtroom experience, I mean experience literally in the courts of common pleas as well as the appellate courts. And it's really, truly disconcerting to me that we would have candidates of any regard that have never practiced law in any court. And I've spent a substantial amount of my time in front of the courts, especially the Commonwealth Court. And as you're aware, in just the past 4 years in relation just solely to the Commonwealth Court, I've litigated 10 cases, of which we've already been successful in 8 of them. The other 2 are still outstanding decision. I don't anticipate losing those, but nevertheless, even just looking at 8 out of 10, that statistically is virtually unheard of for an attorney to have that type of success rate in front of any appellate court. And I truly attribute it to the fact that all I've ever asked any of the courts to do is just simply uphold the law as written and the Constitution as intended. And I've been very, very successful, and I'm very blessed in that regard. But I truly believe it's a calling to, represent the people of this Commonwealth in ensuring that their rights are always protected.
Yeah, I mean, you wouldn't think that someone would run for dog catcher if they've never been in the room with a dog before.
Or they don't like dogs.
Or they don't like that. Well, I mean, maybe the dog catcher doesn't like dogs, but they'd have been around dogs, know how to handle a dog, right? You've argued in that particular court a number of times, right? So as far as the process and the procedure, you're very well versed in that. It would make sense that you would make a good home in that particular court.
And what many of your viewers may not be aware of is it's actually the only court in the nation that acts both as a trial court and an appellate court, depending on the legal issue before it. It also is the only court in the nation that is designed to be a court of government oversight. And that's why I've spent my career really before it. I hold a number of injunctions against Commonwealth agencies and officials that have violated our state statutes and constitutional rights. I hold injunctions against then Attorney General, now Governor Shapiro, as well as the Pennsylvania State Police for violating our rights. And in fact, one of the more recent cases that I litigated involved the Pennsylvania State Police not performing what we refer to as instantaneous background checks. And when I say we refer to that, I mean the fact that the state statute calls them instantaneous background checks. And what was occurring about 10 months ago is that these background checks for many individuals were taking in excess of 3 days. And we actually had instances of it taking in excess of 5 days. And in fact, in one instance, the individual requesting the background check was a federal firearms licensee. So there was no doubt that the individual could not be a prohibited person, and yet it took a substantial amount of time for the Pennsylvania State Police to actually approve that person's background check. And everyone said that it was an impossibility to do anything about it. And I said, well, give me an opportunity to do something about it. So we filed a petition with the Commonwealth Court, as well as a request for an injunction. Commonwealth Court Judge McCullough actually presided over that injunction hearing, that preliminary injunction hearing. And it was really interesting, some of the testimony that I was able to solicit from the Pennsylvania State Police. So they had a Lieutenant Keeler testify, and on direct examination, she basically testified that it was an impossibility for them to perform the background checks any faster. She also testified that beyond the fact that they were 8 employees below what funding currently allowed for, that they needed 20 additional employees, so a total of 28 employees, to be able to perform these background checks truly instantaneously. On my cross-examination, I got her to acknowledge the fact of a number of different things. So first and foremost, she acknowledged the fact that with regards to the 8 employees that they were down, they had not posted any job openings for those individuals. When I asked her about the additional 20 employees that she had contended the General Assembly had refused funding for, she had to acknowledge that there was a special restricted account where anytime someone basically submits for a background check, a portion of that fee is put into this restricted account that can only be used for hiring Pennsylvania Instant Check System background check employees, and that $4 million was in that account. When I asked her whether that $4 million could fund these 20 additional employees, she agreed that it would. And beyond that, we got into the groups or teams that they have and utilize. They have 3 basic teams. They had 2 teams on during normal business hours and 1 team on during non-typical business hours. And I asked her, I said, would you agree with me that likely all background, not all, but the majority of background checks come during non-typical business hours, since most people are working and thus they're unable to submit to a background check? And she said yes. And I asked her, I said, you know, of these different teams, do you do any analyses as to when the most background checks come in? And she said, well, yes. And I said, is it fair to say that you should have the most on during those times where you get the highest number? She said yes. I asked, when are they supposed to do these analyses? And she said, well, once a year. I asked, when's the last time you did one? She said, I don't know. I said, do you have one planned? She's like, no. And it was just really, really interesting. So Commonwealth Court Judge McCullough issues an injunction saying you got to comply with the state statute. The state statute says they're supposed to be instantaneous. You have to perform them instantaneously. Now, remember, her original testimony was that it was an impossibility for them to perform them any faster. Within a week of that decision coming down, I heard from numerous federal firearms licensees, so your gun dealers, that they had not seen a delay of more than 3 hours and that in 99.99% of the background checks that they had put through, they were approved instantaneously, or they got a response, I should say, instantaneously.
It's amazing how that just kind of happened.
Right.
Well, and that's why elections matter. You know, there is no doubt in my mind that came down from the governor to Commissioner Evanchik that, you know, basically, hey, look, these are issues that we don't want you really addressing quickly. Don't have your employees be performing these background checks that quickly. There's no urgency there. And as soon as a court steps in and upholds our statutory rights, now all of a sudden, in the absence of these 28 necessary employees per the testimony, they're still able to perform them instantaneously. And that's a huge concern for me, because we consistently see how the courts can ensure our rights are protected. And unfortunately, in many regards, we frequently see the courts not protecting our rights, issuing what I would refer to as political instead of judicial decisions. And it affects everyone in the Commonwealth. And
well, I mean, you could take a look at how the map has been redrawn by the courts, and that changed the entire political balance within the legislature.
Absolutely. And you know, that was in large part because individuals did not get out to vote in 2015. We saw 3 candidates for the Supreme Court who are very liberal in their view of the statutory law and the Constitution get elected to the Supreme Court. And many people think that, you know, elections in a municipal election year don't matter. But in reality, we see the large majority of our judicial elections occur in municipal election years. And since then, we've seen, in my opinion, a lot of basically political instead of judicial decisions being rendered. And, you know, it's very concerning to me, because now what it appears to be is that we have kings and queens on our judiciary instead of judges. And there is no respect for the co-equal branches of government. And that's everything that is opposed to what I stand for, because I, you know, have historically and throughout all the litigation that I've argued and litigated, shown that, you know, we have to respect what our founding fathers intended to be our republic, that there is a reason why we have 3 co-equal branches of government. And what's most interesting to me is that our founding fathers truly saw the judiciary as the weakest branch of the government, or of the co-equal branches. And, you know, yet now today we see it as the strongest. We see it, you know, basically acting as the legislator, the executive, and the judiciary. And that's very, very concerning to me. So we need to elect judges who will respect what the Constitution is and what was expected of it, that will not legislate from the bench, that will uphold the rule of law regardless of their own personal views. And I know for many judges that becomes difficult at a certain point in time in their career, if not, you know, right from the get-go, because of the fact that, you know, we unfortunately force in Pennsylvania all of our judicial candidates to run under a political platform. And I'm opposed to that. It's the only way, though, to truly end up being elected to the judiciary. But I really think the General Assembly needs to act and needs to preclude all judicial candidates from running under any political platform, because the judiciary is supposed to be blind. I mean, justice is supposed to be blind. The judiciary is supposed to be unbiased. And yet we force our judges to run under political platforms. And it doesn't make any sense to me.
The whole PIC system, the instantaneous background checks, it makes me think of some statement from way back in the beginning. I think it was called taxation without representation, because that's exactly what they're doing, right? They're taxing for the process, and then they're not actually representing by having the amount of people they need to run it until a court steps in and says you must, and then magically it, you know, fixes itself. That's
a good argument.
Yeah.
I tell you. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Matt. Finish your statement.
No, I was just going to say. I mean, one of my concerns is if you become judge, which we're praying you do, and we're going to give you as much support as we can, and everybody out there listening and watching should too. What's going to happen to your practice? Is your practice, you have people taking over the practice, running the practice while you're, because you obviously can't be a main figure in it because that would be a conflict, I'm assuming, correct?
So that's a great question. And I got that question from a number of people that I highly respect. And yes, we already have an individual, Dylan Harris specifically, who has basically been taking over all of my caseload. There are a couple very, very complex cases or cases that have been hanging on since like 2014 that I'm still handling myself. But beyond that, he's handling all the new cases coming in, and I've mentored him for over 4 years, and he truly gets it. He can think outside of the box. That has really been one of my skill sets, is that I can see things differently than most can. And just as an example in relation to Dylan, there has been an issue in Maryland with regards to expungements and FBI not accepting an expungement order as sufficient to alleviate any federal disability. Now, I think it's very interesting because there is no definition under federal law or state law as to what constitutes an expungement. And in Maryland, any order issued is in a quote unquote expungement order. And yet FBI contends that it wasn't sufficient enough to be an expungement order. I don't know how that occurs when you have no definition of what constitutes an expungement, but regardless, Dylan looked at some of the arguments the FBI had made in relation to why it was not, in their opinion, sufficient enough as an expungement. And he, unlike other attorneys in Maryland, found a way to get a court to actually issue an order that was consistent with what FBI was contending needed to be issued. Now, there were attorneys that have been practicing for 5+ decades that have not been successful in being able to figure this out. And yet he, in a matter of months, looking at the issue, was able to figure it out, not only figure it out, but actually get judges to agree with him and issue orders consistent with it, which we now have in communication with FBI understand is sufficient for FBI purposes. And now those individuals have had their rights restored and no longer have issue. So Dylan is prepared to handle the matters. And the other interesting thing is a lot of people say, Josh, you're running for Commonwealth Court judge. You're not going to be there. You're not going to be there to defend our Second Amendment rights. And I say, when you say "our," that includes me. I'm not, any special elitist or anything of that nature. I am not one of those who believes that if I am blessed with this opportunity to be a judge and represent the Commonwealth, that I have special privileges or such compared to you. So I am just as concerned about ensuring that my rights are protected. And if I had any concern that there would not be someone in place to ensure that my rights are protected, I surely would not be looking at this opportunity with, basically the thought process that I am, because I am cognizant of the fact that we need to ensure that all of our constitutional rights, including the Second Amendment, are protected, and that we have proper advocates in our courts prepared to address those legal issues.
That is awesome.
Yeah, we've worked with Dylan, County League, Allegheny County Sportsman's League, and FOAC. Dylan wrote a amicus brief for us last year, and I've consulted with him on a couple of occasions. And yeah, he's pretty switched on, man. Pretty switched on. I think we would be in good hands with him, and having someone like you, and you specifically, on the bench, I think would be a huge win for the people of Pennsylvania. So what I was saying before, when I tried to cut off Matt there, I guess you were talking about the founding fathers and their view of the judiciary being kind of the weakest of the three. It's interesting you say that, not really related to anything specifically here that we're talking about, but as far as that idea, I've been on Amazon. You can get a channel called The Great Courses. You guys familiar with that? No. So on Amazon Prime, you can get channels you can add to the service. And, you can get like Discovery, you could get like Bravo channel if you want to like watch Queer Eye for the whatever, you could watch all those different shows and stuff, right? Well, anyhow, they have the Great Courses, and there's courses on there from like astrophysics to like learn how to play banjo and shit like that. But they have a class on the founding fathers and one on the Federalist Papers. And each episode is a lecture that runs anywhere from a half hour to 45 minutes. And there's like 25 lectures. I've gone through both of them, and I started going through the Founding Fathers one again. The interesting thing is the Founding Fathers one starts at the Constitutional Convention. And, that was originally supposed to be, they were going in there to kind of tweak the Articles of Confederation, and they shut the windows and doors and said, you know what, we're going to nuke it. And they started this whole new Constitution that we have. And of course, if someone watching doesn't know, the Federalist Papers were arguments and articles that were written by some of the Founding Fathers that would argue for and against federalism and the Constitution. And it really gives you an insight as to what their original intent was, with a lot of the things we take for granted and just interpret in modern day vernacular. So if you got the Amazon Prime and you can't sleep at night like I can't, get on there and get the great courses, like $8 a month. And there's some fantastic lectures and seminars on there.
Nice. I know what I'm watching tonight.
One of the things I just want to mention in that regard, I truly, honestly, never thought that I would live long enough to see a court, especially the U.S. Supreme Court, acknowledge the fact that when we analyze any type of constitutional provision, and maybe I'm going a little bit further than what the U.S. Supreme Court said, and I'll come back to that in a second, but basically you are to look at what the understanding of our founding fathers was at the time of founding, or at least at the time of enactment of the Bill of Rights, which was, a couple years later, 1796. But, what is truly interesting when you look at that in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin is the fact that the court did say that we have to go back in time to look at what the understanding was. And I love when people say, well, wasn't the Constitution intended to be a living, breathing document? And I can simply respond back with the question of, well, why do you believe that? Because if our founding fathers intended for the Constitution to be a living, breathing document, why'd they include an amendment process? It'd be wholly unnecessary, because the Constitution would simply evolve, right? Yep. The fact that they included an amendment process was because of the fact that they did not intend for the Constitution to be a living, breathing document, but acknowledged that there may come a time where we, the people, decided that the Constitution, or at least certain provisions of it, no longer suited our purpose, and that we could, change it. Now, talking about the Pennsylvania Constitution specifically, I think it's even more interesting when you look at a provision that, to my knowledge, I have yet to been able to find a court to actually analyze, and that's Article 1, Section 25. And I know probably most of the viewers were ready to jump to Article 1, Section 21, which is our Second Amendment provision here in Pennsylvania. But no, I'm talking about Article 1, Section 25. And what Section 25 says is that all the rights enumerated in Article 1 are, quote unquote, exempted out of the power of government and are inviolate. Think about that for a second. If those rights are inviolate and exempted out of the power of government, they are something that the government could never amend, nor could arguably we amend, because the amendment process in the Pennsylvania Constitution requires it first to go to the General Assembly. Well, how can it go to the General Assembly if it's exempted out of the power of the government? So it's just a really interesting issue. I do believe in natural rights or divine rights, and I think the Pennsylvania Constitution in Article 1, Section 25 gets it right, that these rights enumerated in Article 1 are exempted out of the powers of government because they are those natural or otherwise divine rights.
Well, now that you brought up the whole idea of amending the Constitution, I wasn't thinking we'd talk about this, but I'll throw it out there. There are two processes under Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution. One is one that's been done many times, like 27 times. The other way talks about a constitutional convention. It's never been tried. It's never been done. And there's a lot of people, especially a lot of Republicans, that are pushing for an Article 5 constitutional convention. I'm wondering what your comments are on that.
So I always have concern over the Article 5 convention because of what I'll refer to as the vagueness of what is included in it. while it's clear that the states have to basically say that there is an issue they want addressed, it does not restrict the Article 5 convention simply to that issue or those issues specified to bring it into existence. And therefore, it would seemingly allow for anything and everything to occur during that. Beyond that, I would go back to a more simplistic response as to my concern over it, in that I cannot fathom how one can write a more broad listing of rights than what already exists in the Bill of Rights. The only reason that the Bill of Rights have been limited is through judicial interpretations, which I believe to be erroneous and improper. I believe that, if you want to add words like, any limiting language or such, and, I had great respect for Justice Scalia, but even he would say that there are certain limitations on the Second Amendment that are not found in the text of the Second Amendment. And I think if you want to include any limitations on it, well, then the only recourse is to basically put forth an amendment to it, not to have the judiciary insert language that does not exist within it. And so my big concern with any Article 5 convention is I don't think, even if we can come up with or conjure more broad language for any constitutional provision, that it truly gets us anywhere, because in all likelihood, what we're going to see is the courts simply come down and interpret it consistent with what they've already interpreted it with, if not something more restrictive, saying, well, now they've amended it and it no longer means what we previously contended. Now it's even more limited, even though the language I would hope would be more broad. So like I said, that's my big concerns over any Article 5 convention. And a lot of people don't want to actually talk about that. I know there's a large push because there's a lot of people who are concerned for a republic and where everything's going. And I share in those concerns. I'm not going to, lie in that regard, but I'm not sure the Article 5 convention is a solution to that problem. I really think the solution to the problem lies within the judiciary, and getting the judiciary to be reined in essence, that the judiciary cannot be kings and queens, and we need a judiciary that respects the co-equal branches of government, that will only uphold the law as written in the Constitution as intended. And that's really, in the end of the day, where I think it stands, what we need. And like I said earlier, I was, you could have knocked me over with a feather when we saw the Bruin decision and the U.S. Supreme Court taking that position, because another aspect of that has gone largely underreported is the fact that historically, with any constitutional provision, we go into what we refer to as interest balancing. Now, if you look at the U.S. Constitution, you will not find anywhere in the Constitution, and this includes the Pennsylvania Constitution, any interest balancing. Nevertheless, the judiciary has created this interest balancing in relation to most constitutional provisions, whereby, depending on the issue involved, they'll say either rational basis scrutiny applies, or intermediate scrutiny applies, or strict scrutiny applies. And as I said, that you don't find any of those terms found in the Constitution. What was so refreshing about the U.S. Supreme Court's decision in Bruin, and this is a court that previously has endorsed all those different levels of scrutiny, and in fact, in many regards, they're responsible for levels of scrutiny even existing in any constitutional analysis. But in Bruin, they said, no, you don't go to any level of scrutiny, because the Second Amendment itself was the interest balancing that our founding fathers entered into in determining what our Second Amendment rights were. Why this is so refreshing to me is, although the U.S. Supreme Court didn't address it in the context of other Bill of Rights provisions, I don't see how you can analyze them any differently. And it would seem to me that we're at a new frontier of analysis for all of our constitutional rights, our First Amendment, Fourth, Fifth, Sixth Amendment rights, in the sense that we have to look back at the time of founding, what was intended by the founding fathers. And we can't look to the, mid 1800s, late 1800s, early 1900s, yada, yada, for an interpretation. No, rather, the understanding of the Constitution comes from around the time of founding explicitly. And, so I'm curious to see what will happen, whether we're going to have more judges push back on that, or whether they're going to embrace it, and whether they're going to do a proper analysis as to what was intended by the founding fathers in relation to all those constitutional provisions.
Yeah. The big thing about the Constitutional Convention that would scare me is that there are so many kings and queens up there on the bench, and if that ended up happening, would anything get done? And then if anything did get done, would it be just one-sided like we're seeing now? That's my big concern, is we're so far separated, and there's so many lazy and selfish people these days that it's I don't think it would be as productive as it would have been in the beginning of our founding of our country.
Well, you have to look at the context of it too. You have to keep in mind that in essence, those men that framed our Constitution just went through, an Article 5 Constitutional Convention, essentially. So they took what was their framework and just threw it out and started again. And I believe, reading what I have, limit, I'm by no means no expert. And, looking at lectures, those things I talked about before, I can't think but that the founding fathers only meant for that second clause to be a nuke it, start over from scratch kind of option. That's the only way I can interpret it. So I think it's dangerous to go there. But we're running a little bit low on time. And I wanted to ask you, Josh, if someone's going to pick up a guitar and start to play guitar, there's someone they look up to, like Eddie Van Halen, or if they're like in the drums, they like Neil Peart or somebody else, or if they want to play baseball, it's like Barry Bonds before he took all the steroids. But
or if they want to be an attorney, they look up to Josh Prince.
Well, that's absolutely true. But you're looking to get into being a judge here. Who's a judge or a justice, or someone that you really, really, really look up to? Like, if you could put their poster on the wall, you might have. So I got to admit, if we're talking about someone who has been a judge or justice, I have a great deal of respect for Justice Scalia. Now, that being said, I would say early Justice Scalia as compared to latter Justice Scalia, because the longer he was on the bench, the more I feel he kind of strayed from a strict constructionist approach. And, maybe there's only once you're on the court, can you truly understand that? But nevertheless, I still cannot fathom doing that, because of the fact that, it is for our General Assembly or our Congress to enact the laws or repeal or amend them, modify them in any way. It is for we, the people, to change our Constitution in any way. It is never for the courts to do that in any regard. And as I mentioned before, we saw, Justice Scalia in regards to DC v. Heller say that reasonable restrictions were permitted, even though you don't see that in the constitutional provision. So that's why I'd say, if you actually look at Justice Scalia's opinions when he first came onto the court, they were more strict constructionists than they were prior to his death. So I have a great amount of respect for him. I also have a great amount of respect for someone who has not been a judge, and that's Trey Gowdy. He is a true intellect, and the way in which he analyzes statutory law and the Constitution, I have great respect for. I am truly sorry that he did not take the opportunity that I believe was offered to him for him to be on the courts, maybe not the U.S. Supreme Court. And I understand he may have been holding out hope for a position there, and I have full respect for that. But nevertheless, as a professor, I think he can really shape minds and help the next generation of attorneys understand what is truly necessary. But in my opinion, he is a phenomenal intellect, and I would love nothing more than to have dinner with that man, just to pick his brain and get some understanding as to, how he came to the positions that he has and how he deals with, different situations that he has had to address. But yeah.
Yeah, I concur with the Trey Gowdy. I've always admired, you definitely, and him as well. So it's neat to hear that you you admire him as well.
And early Scalise. So that's like David Lee Roth era Van Halen versus Sammy Hagar era Van Halen, right? That's
Klint and his music references.
Well,
yeah,
you know,
of course.
yeah.
It's all going to go back to music.
Yeah, somehow. So what can people do to help you right now, currently? And this episode will air reasonably soon. It won't be a long time. You're right now getting signatures together, correct?
Correct. So it's petition process period. So we're basically getting signatures at a minimum. I need 1,000 signatures from across the Commonwealth, with at least 100 coming from 5 counties. So that I don't have any type of petition challenge regarding, specific signatures and such like that. As a general rule of thumb, anyone wants about 3 times the amount that's stated as required. So we're working on that. I don't know that this will necessarily air before or in enough time to assist with that, because all signatures need to be filed no later than March 7th. So that's the pressing need. Beyond that, obviously, if you have an opportunity to go on Prince for Justice, that's PRINCEFORJUSTICE.com, you will see a lot of information about me. I've received a number of endorsements from elected officials and pro-rights organizations from across the Commonwealth. Just real quick, some of the ones I'm most proud of. So the Pennsylvania Sheriff Association Action PAC has endorsed me. I also have a number of individual sheriffs from across the Commonwealth that have endorsed me because they know my law and order background. Mm-hmm. I've also been endorsed by Representative Dave Zimmerman in the Lancaster County area. He's actually one of the only state reps that opposed Act 77. That is the bill that provided us with mail-in ballots. I'm also endorsed by Bradford County Commissioner Doug McClinko. For some of your listeners, they may be aware he was the one who actually challenged the constitutionality of Act 77, something that then Commonwealth Court Judge McCullough had ruled consistent with his arguments was unconstitutional. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court would later overturn that decision. Beyond that, I also have been endorsed by Representative Kathy Rapp, who is an ardent supporter of our Constitution, and a number of other individuals. So if you go on our website, there's a sub-page just for endorsements of those individuals that have endorsed me. Also, I got to throw this one out for your viewers. Just this past week, I was endorsed by Dick Heller, and that is the Dick Heller of DCV Heller fame. So awesome. I'm very, very proud of that endorsement. I also have been endorsed by Firearm Owners Against Crime PAC, as well as Gun Owners of America and Alan Gottlieb of the Second Amendment Foundation. Awesome. So we've received, as well as Klint did endorse me for the the Trigger Pressers Union. So I'm very honored to have that endorsement as well. Right. But beyond all of that, obviously telling your friends, family, and neighbors about my candidacy, directing them to our Facebook page. So our Facebook page, if you type in Facebook Prince for Justice, you will find it. Technically on Instagram, Twitter, and also Facebook, it's Prince for PA was the only available common denominator there. So we do have those Facebook pages and Instagram social media pages. So if you go on and like them, greatly appreciate it. That way you can, stay abreast of any different, issues that may arise, or of our different publications and endorsements, because we have a number of endorsements that will be coming out in the weeks to come as well. So I really, really appreciate all that. And, most importantly, May 16th, I do have a primary opponent. So if you are a registered Republican, or even if you're not and you're willing to change your registration, you still have time to do that, to be able to vote for me. I would greatly appreciate it. As I alluded to before, it is kind of abhorrent, maybe too strong of a word, but I am very disheartened to know that we have judicial candidates that have never argued in a court of law. And my opponent is one of them, and she's acknowledged that. She spent the past 10 years as being the Senate parliamentarian, so the Senate secretary, And so she has a number of connections with the Pennsylvania Senate, which is why she believes that she will be successful in this race. And I think that's everything that's wrong with our system. And again, that goes back to the political nature of things. Instead of having the most qualified candidates be our candidates. And so, on May 16th is the primary election. So please remember Josh Prince and vote for me. Right now, we haven't yet done I forget the terminology they use, but basically the pick to find out whether we'll be first or second on the list of candidates for Commonwealth Court. But nevertheless, I will hopefully, as long as we get enough signatures, which I'm not truly concerned about right now, we'll be on the ballot.
Well, looking forward to seeing you on that ballot, seeing you win that primary, and see you ultimately take that position, Josh. I thank you for all the work that you have done in the Commonwealth for our individual rights, chiefly our right to defend ourselves and those that we love. And whatever we can do to help you, please don't hesitate to ask.
Yeah, so always good catching up with you.
Likewise, and I really appreciate that. And I know a lot of people think that I'm a one-trick pony, that I only know how to argue Second Amendment issues. But if you actually spend the time to look at all the different types of legal arguments I've made and issues I've handled, you'll see that I've handled constitutional issues of every regard. And in fact, with regards just to the COVID mandates, many people are surprised to learn that the original COVID mandate actually forced the closure of all law firms. So no one could challenge Governor Wolf's executive fiats. And I was the attorney that filed a special petition with the Pennsylvania Supreme Court contending that that was unconstitutional. Shortly after filing, Governor Wolf had the first of his lifetime epiphany and found that law firms were essential. Now, remember, this is the same Governor Wolf whose family cabinet making business remained open the entire time during the COVID mandates. I'm not sure how a cabinet making business is essential, but nevertheless, apparently it was. But
you said cabinet making, not coffin making.
Correct, cabiet.
Just wanted to clarify
I guess everybody needs a cupboard to put their bullshit in, and that's what Governor Wolf did right there.
But so, we use that same mechanism to get gun dealers declared to be essential, went on to represent a bunch of small businesses that were being fined by the Wolf administration. One that many people have heard of might be Taste of Sicily. They had been fined tens of thousands of dollars by the Wolf administration for alleged violations of the COVID mandates, and we were successful in getting all those fines thrown out. We then went on to represent a bunch of school boards and school officials who were getting pressure from the Wolf administration regarding forced masking and vaccinations of the children. And they said, hey, listen, this isn't our lane. And we said, we agree, this is a parental rights issue. So we provided them with legal advice and guidance as to how to handle those matters. And to this day, started by the Wolf administration, now continued on by the Shapiro administration, they're using the Liquor Control Board to revoke the liquor licenses of any establishment that is alleged to have violated the COVID mandates. And of course, with the LCB, the Liquor Control Board, being right under the governor's office, they're a rubber stamp for the governor. So all those cases are, resulting in revocation of their licenses, whereby now they got to appeal up to the courts to vindicate their rights. So that's why truly the judiciary matters so much. And all of your listeners, mainly those in Pennsylvania, really need to get out to vote, because this election cycle, we have 4 major appellate court vacancies. We have 1 on the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, 2 on the Superior Court, and 1 on the Commonwealth Court. And as I mentioned before, I am running for the Commonwealth Court position. But at the end of the day, the most important, election on the ballot is that for the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. We need to ensure that we get a true conservative elected to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court who understands that, the role of the judiciary is only to uphold the law as written and the Constitution as intended. And I would proffer to you that if that is of concern to you, the only true candidate who fits that mold is Commonwealth Court Judge Patricia McCullough. So please remember her name in the upcoming election cycle.
The fact that that is what you're going to end with tells me that you care more about our Commonwealth and our rights and our freedoms than even your own position. And I thank you for that. There's a reason why we should all vote for Josh Prince.
Definitely. I'm moving to PA.
Yeah. Well,
you got to crawl under the barbed wire first, though.
Watch out for the landmines.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. We have to get moving here. And so, Josh, I just want to thank you for coming on the show. And we wish you the best of luck in this election and anything else that you end up doing. And we hope to see you on the bench come November.
Well, thanks, Klint and Matt. I really appreciate this opportunity. And anytime, you want to do another show, let me know.
Cool.
Thank
you again. Take care. Hello, my name is Klint Macro. I'm the co-founder and administrator of National Train a Teacher Day. National Train a Teacher Day is a grassroots movement of volunteer firearm, safety, and defense instructors who are pledging to give free training to those who are charged with the safety and education of our children. This free training is available to teachers, school staff, administrators, and those that work with youth in a leadership capacity. That could be clergy, rabbis, Sunday school teachers, scout leaders, football coaches, or bus drivers. This year marks our 6th annual National Train a Teacher Day, and we will be observing it on June 17th, 2023. That's Saturday, June 17th, 2023. If you would like to take advantage of different types of training, such as firearm safety training, emergency first aid training, defensive training, tactical training, feel free to go onto the website and find a volunteer instructor near you. The website is nationaltrainateacherday.com. If you would like to volunteer your time for National Train a Teacher Day, you can visit the website and volunteer as well. I hope to see you all on National Train a Teacher Day this year, June 17th, 2023.
There's a lot of sponsors to make this show possible, like Mantis.
Make sure you check them out and give them your business.
This episode is brought to you by Saber Red, pepper spray and safety products for all Americans. Next Level Training, makers of CERT training products. Mantis. Mantis X helps shooters suck less. Firearms Owners Against Crime Institute for Legal, Legislative, and Educational Action. Meet the Pressers is also supported by other shows, companies, and our Patreon members. Thank you.
Thanks for watching or listening to our show.
Make sure to like, comment, subscribe, share, click that little bell thingy so you know when the next episode's uploaded. Support us on Patreon. Come to one of our classes. Host us to come to you and do one of our classes at your location.
And until next time,
adieu.
Thank you for watching Meet the Pressers.